or understanding at a European level about the fact that not only the history and present of our countries is marked by racism, but also the history and present of Europe in as such. But at the same time, and this is how and this is what I will be talking about, my sense is that we experience time and again that we do not always talk about the same things with European colleagues when we talk about racism. I am, though, very happy to be part of a panel with John Solomos and Sarah Mazus, both of whom I know very well and whose work I greatly appreciate. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the panel. My apologies to everyone that I will have to leave early. This is because there are exams at my university and I just couldn't get out of them. Let me begin. In my very short contribution, I will guide you through 3 very simple points. Firstly, I will commence with a question for the discussion. Secondly, I will then bring some material for the discussion and illustrate material from Germany. So I think this was the most difficult task to do because while at the same time we all follow the discussion in other European countries and elsewhere on racism, we never assume, or at least I don't assume, that you are very familiar with the situation in Germany. So let me talk about a couple of things, and maybe it will, at least if you know about them already, be interesting in the way I will talk about them. And thirdly, I will make and also end with a conceptual proposal, and I hope this then goes beyond the situation in Germany, drawing back to my initial question. So the first point, my question. So I have already said that at a European level, but also globally, we don't always talk about the same thing when we talk about racism. We experience this all the more when we have international conversations. But we also experience it sometimes in our own countries, between generations of researchers on racism, and also, of course, depending on who we are talking to. And I take for granted here those who share with us that an understanding of racism is a pressing issue in our present, and not those who will still claim that it is negligible or something from the old days or reducible to a small social group of racists. I would like to sharpen this observation to a question with which I would like to contribute to the discussion amongst all of us. Should we, taking this experience as a starting point, speak of racism or rather of racisms in the plural? On the one hand, the clear advantage of starting from racisms in the plural is to make the plethora of phenomena in which racism exists describable and systematizable. I'm sorry for this word. This is very German and introduced into English, I assume. The disadvantage, however, could be that we have too many modes of appearances and description whose unity remains unclear. What then justifies talking about them all as racism? On the other hand, the clear advantage of speaking of racism is to have a concept that allows us to still say something common about this plethora of phenomena, both historically changing and geographically varying. And we would have a concept that we can claim brings us into conversation with each other, like any good translation, not quite one-to-one, but mediating in a high approximation. Before you wonder why I come with such a question instead of, as promised, reporting on the specific situation of racism in Germany, I would just like to say at this point that this question is of particular importance for the discussion in Germany from my point of view, so that we can move forward together in research on racism and in the fight against racism. On the one hand, this question arises because in recent years, we have experienced a series of events in Germany that have been described as racist or associated with racism, although they are very heterogeneous. On the other hand, this series of violence, discursive as well as physical, from which I will pick out only a few events in the following order to bring them to mind here, was meanwhile provoked action at government level. It led to the promise of the specially appointed Cabinet Committee to combat right-wing extremism and racism to use 1 billion euros in the future to support preventive work against racism, research on racism, and victim protection. However, a planned amendment to the Grundgesetz, in which the category of race was to be deleted from the constitution, has not been implemented in the current legislature. In order to provide a concise overview of racist events in Germany for our international discussion today, I will limit myself to events that occur downright on the surface of society, where racism appears openly and not where it becomes entrenched in everyday life, reproduced in discourses, or where it permeates in institutions, which I could also do. If all good things come in threes, then here today, my racist events will come in fours. I will give 4 examples from the last decade. Such a list of racist events in the past cannot but begin with the uncovering of the NSU 10 years ago. On 4th of November 2011, the German public was confronted with the existence of the right-wing terrorist trio, Nationalist Socialist Underground. Some assumed that ignorance and trivialization of racism, incompetence, cover-up, and failure have decisively shaped the way police and secret services have dealt with extreme right-wing violence and racism since the early 90s. This fatal mixture also made the emergence of the NSU and its acts of violence possible. Others, on the other hand, were more or less firmly convinced that the NSU would never have been able to murder for so long without the help or support of the police or secret services, or at least individual representatives of state authorities. A parliamentary committee of inquiry set up by the Bundestag in November 2011 shed light on the matter. Its central question was, how was it possible for a neo-Nazi group to murder 9 migrant tradespeople and a policewoman without hindrance over the course of 12 years, to seriously injure another policeman, to carry out 2 explosive attacks with over 20 injured, and to carry out a dozen bank robberies? The wives, parents, and other relatives of the murder victims were suspected of perpetration for months and years. Their telephone connections were tapped, their cars bugged. The fact that the suspects did not provide any useful clues to possible perpetrators was then justified with the existence of a, I quote, silence cartel typical of the migrant milieu. And when several hundred people from the affected community demonstrated after the murders in Kassel and Dortmund in April 2007 and pointed to the possible right-wing perpetrators, this was at best only marginally noted by the media and the investigators. 400,000 sheets of paper and 24 witnesses have been sifted through and heard by the 22 MPs on the committee over the course of 6 months in 2012. What all happened afterwards, what the findings of the Parliamentary Investigative Committee were in detail, what social distortions exist to this day, and what convictions were reached in the 10 years long trial against the NSU in Munich is too complex to be reported here. But it is important to note, however, that it was only with the uncovering of the NSU, with the still unclear involvement, or rather the failure of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and the police, that a public discussion about racism has ever begun. So I'm not arguing that racism hasn't been a topic in Germany before, but this was the clear historical incident in which it became a public debate. Since the uncovering of the NSU, there has by no means been an end to right-wing extremist or racist activities. Only a few years later, and so this is my second example, with the Refugee Movement of 2015, which is to be my second event to the list here, this met with a still strongly organized far-right scene. For years before, supposedly independent so-called citizens' initiatives and the right-wing extremist party NPD, which was at that time active, more active than the AfD, have been campaigning against refugees and their accommodation in East and West German municipalities. Under the slogan, "No to the Home," they openly called for violence against asylum seekers. For a long time, the number of threats against and attacks on refugee homes, homes of Roma and Sinti, and anti-racist activists has risen accordingly. The special role that the figure of the refugee and the talk of the refugee crisis has taken on since 2015 for a strengthening of right extremism parties and movements and racist organizing continues to take on to this day. And it is another example for which racism research must, in my view, explain how it could come about that almost all social problems were attributed to this figure of the refugee, who is actually in need of protection, and not only in everyday life, by professing Nazis or by right-wing parties like the AfD, but also up to the statement of the Minister of the Interior, Horst Seehofer, who concluded publicly, "Migration is the mother of all problems." How could it be that in everyday life and then in public debate, it became acceptable to discuss whether people fleeing the Mediterranean should be rescued at all when they find themselves in distress at sea? This question had been posed in a pro and con debate in 2018 in the weekly newspaper Die Zeit, which asked on the front page whether it was legitimate to rescue people at sea in the Mediterranean. This example is specifically about the fact that a respected weekly newspaper began to discursively justify letting fleeing people die as possibly legitimate. Interestingly, these discursive legitimations do not mention or explain the regime and the proliferation of European borders and their surveillance. They do not explain the contrast of leaving people to die in the Mediterranean and subjecting others, arrivals, to a regime of integration. Here, in my opinion, the same people, refugees, are identified and stigmatized as irreversible other, racialized, left to die, while at the same time they are to be assimilated. In the course of the NSU uncovering and the refugee movement context, not only the number of racist attacks and racist violence has massively increased in recent years, shelters of refugees have been attacked, but also a Christian Democrat government president, Walter Lübcke, was shot dead in front of his house, who thought it was right to take in refugees and who stood up for solidarity with refugees. The alleged perpetrators were neo-Nazis who had been organized for many years. He had obviously hurt the feelings of those extremists when he spoke of those who did not agree with such value concepts as solidarity being at liberty to leave Germany. I will now give you quickly two more examples. The murder of Walter Lübcke, the CDU government president in Kassel, in June 2019 was just 4 months ago when the horrific anti-Semitic, racist, right-wing terrorist attack in Halle an der Saale in Germany with 2 dead, 50 fortunately survivors and many injured took place. A right-wing extremist wanted to cause a massacre in a synagogue on the 9th of October 2019, the highest Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur. He tried to get past the locked entrance door at gunpoint, but it withstood numerous shots and homemade explosive devices. When the attacker failed to enter the synagogue, he shot a 40-year-old female passerby and a 20-year-old man in a nearby kebab restaurant. Given the short amount of time left that I have, I will simply remind everyone of the fourth event that you probably all know best. On 19 February 2020, just 4 months later, after the Halle incident, a racist rampage killer in Hanau killed 9 citizens in a shisha bar, then drove home, killed his mother, and then himself. There is clearly more to say about all these 4 examples than I can do here due to the shortness of time. There are also far more, being the only racist events during this time. I think this is clear and I have said so. But the reason I have mentioned them is that they develop like on a string of pearls over 10 years. The first thing that has been noticeable since then is that there is explicit talk of racism in a large number of articles in the media. Halle has officially named as an anti-Semitic attack and Hanau as extreme right-wing and racist. This tends to be new. It is based on the persistent work of anti-racist actors in the field of theory and memory work, changing linguistic patterns and educational policy work, migration policy interventions, anti-racist activism and victim counseling, and much more. All of this often created synergies between activists, artists, media workers, as well as academics. But it also had to do, of course, with the documented Völkisch exterminatory attitudes of the perpetrators in the case of the NSU, Kassel, Halle, and Hanau. In the context of the NSU murder series, for example, this talk about racism only began very slowly. I've also purposefully included the events surrounding the refugee movements in and after 2015, the racial shifts in the media, the attacks on refugee homes, because they do not only come from the repertoire of right-wing extremism and are racially motivated. I could also have mentioned racial profiling, the systemic exclusion in schools, etc. Events could be found for this as well. But in Germany, until when the ascriptions of racism in the public began, and sometimes still today, common terms such as Ausländerfeindlichkeit or xenophobia obstructed a more precise understanding and analysis of the situation. For terms like these have the effect of associating racist violence with precisely those who are the victims of this violence. It is not uncommon to read that racism is due to the presence of a certain group of refugees or immigrants or Black people or Roma or Jewish people, often in the variant that there are too many XYZ here with us. A historical parallel for orientation that is absolutely important for the German situation. No one in a serious analysis would think to attribute the Nazi extermination policy of German National Socialism to Jewish life in Germany. Care must be taken here not to explain racism with racist arguments, exactly what right-wing demagogues do. But the heterogeneity of the events that I just mapped out over the last 10 years, which are nevertheless all associated with racism, pose conceptual questions to our understanding of racism. Is the murder of Walter Lübcke or the shooting in a kebab snack bar in Halle a racist act? In the cases of Kassel and Halle, the perpetrators were concerned with attacking those who undermined an imagined ethnic nationalist religious unity by standing up for those in need of protection, like Lübcke, or by practicing a self-evident everyday culture, having a meal in a kebab snack bar. Secondly, it is interesting that with the attack in Hanau, it was read as one on all of us. This is not only a gesture of solidarity with which we insist on not letting ourselves be divided, it is also analytically plausible, I would argue. Racism does not lead to an enmity of groups, it rather produces these groups as opposing and hierarchical. Racism is therefore acceptable or not in a society. And it contributes to the systemic deterioration of the conditions of existence of certain social groups, depending on the historical situation, to the point where their very existence is called into question. I come to the conclusion. If we ask the question of whether we want to speak of racisms in the plural or racism, then from my point of view, we must focus less on categorical and group logical analysis and explanations that always link racism to the existence of certain social groups and then speak of anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, anti-Slavism, etc. But rather focus on racism as a social relationship. Concrete analyses that are oriented towards practices and contexts located in time and history can then show how racisms often reinforce each other, as they did over the course of 10 years in Germany, and explain each other and also contradict each other. Racism is free from uniformity or logic, I would say, but it is far too powerful across this heterogeneity of modes of existence. Thank you very much.
Please join me to thank Manuela from a distance. And as I said at the beginning, we will take 5 minutes as Manuela has to leave earlier to open questions from the floor. So just switch on your camera, unmute yourself, and please, or you can also use the chat if you prefer, write your question. I don't see.
I'll break the ice then. I was wondering, in your discussion, what role you see for the media in, as you describe racism as a more social phenomenon.
Well, I think that there's several ways to go about this, and it would take a long time to answer this. And I think that that we definitely need more studies on new media to understand how racism is changing, particularly within right-wing organizing. Sorry, there's strange feedback here, sound-wise. But I'd like to give you one example from the material that I provided. So, for example, the perpetrator in Hanau, he referred to Anders Breivik and to the perpetrator in Christchurch. And for him, these people have been idols, and he has learned from them. So he took them as an example, or excuse me. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So he took it as an example, and he was inspired by those acts. And at the same time, he was looking at the French New Right theorist, Renaud Camus, who inspired him about ethno-pluralism. So when we look at these cases, what we find, and if we do a media analysis of them, I think, we find that what we need to do urgently in racism theory is actually to understand the problematic that I had just tried to unfold. And this is to say, we need to take more time to understand these different cases, not only in the way they are singular, but also in the way they are connected to each other. And they are connected to each other often in ways that are quite surprising. And they are not reducible to certain historical or territory or a nation state, etc., etc. They have never been, I guess, but of course and the same is true for anti-racism. And there are certain legacies and certain histories of anti-racism that get very popular and very well known through popular culture, etc., etc., and also through, of course, the proliferation of certain journals, etc., etc., where a certain debate, particularly from the Anglophone context, gets much more attention than from other places. And so these are, I think, very big challenges that we need to take up when we need to understand how they are connected, but also how they are located.
One more question.
I jump in.
Jump. Otherwise, I do.
No, please do that, because I'm going to speak at the end. Please go.
Well, Maybe yours is more interesting. I have a question about, you said that these different racism could contradict, and I wanted to have some more example of the contradiction they could raise.
Yeah, that's for example a really interesting point, and I think some research has to go into how they contradict themselves. So, for example, there is, in my understanding, most of the racist attacks that, if you look at their legitimization, they never are coherent. They always try to for example, map out a certain group of people, or flesh out a certain group of people that they are that for example they attract or they attend their hate to, while at the same time there may be histories in which this has been completely differently organized in terms of how racism has worked historically. I can give you one example, and this is, for example, the organizing that we have seen in Germany across the so-called christlich-jüdisches Abendland. So the connection within the racist movements, in which they connected a Christian and a Jewish tradition within Germany, and use this to against anti-Islam, or to basically flesh out the anti-Islamic argumentation. So this is quite interesting, because of course, if we look into the history of how these different racisms are coming together historically, and also that in the right-wing movements, the Jewish question has in Germany been particularly one where anti-Semitism has played a huge role. We can see a shift, but also a contradiction within them, and you can see it playing out within the movements themselves, because of course you have fractions that remain very strongly anti-Semitic, and others who try to use the Jewish tradition to work against Muslims, for example, in Germany. So this is probably one of the most prominent examples, but I think there are so many more, and it would be really helpful to look into them more closely.
Thank you very much. Shall we take one more, or do you want to keep it for the end?
Well, I'm not sure if it's completely articulated, but maybe I will take the opportunity, since Manuela might not be around when it gets to the end. On one hand, when I think also about the contradictions, and my question was more or less in the same direction of Milena, is also the fact that racism is usually a category of accusation, right? Other people are racist. Very few people would embrace this I am being racist, or I am intentionally encouraging racism. And I think that this is the case maybe of the extreme right, but I would say that not even then. So I'm wondering how much we should not also unpack the experiences and the narratives by relying on other types of, or breaking up different types of processes. So on one hand, it's true that racism has this sort of general overview, but it's also different processes. So when you think about discrimination processes, it's very different, like direct discrimination, when you are taking people away from certain resources and really creating barriers, from process of stigmatization, when you are just basically putting people down and not recognizing or creating things which would allow you to say, I'm not racist. So how to, and at the same time, how people who are basically trying to argue, like the newspapers in Germany, I'm sure that they very clearly identify the incidents, as you mentioned in your presentation, of the extreme right as racist, but that allows them to claim to make racist statements against refugees without seeing their own racism. So where do you label where racism is also important, and how you label it in different ways or through different processes. So I'm not sure, in that sense, it's very, some people might claim that the racism language should be completely dropped because it encompasses so much things, and instead you should start to break it up in different social processes. So I'm not sure if that's the way that you see, or if you still see using the term racism as a category, as an analytical category.
Yeah, I think I do. I think, you know, it depends on, again, you know, we don't have enough time, but I think it depends very much on the general, most abstract definition of racism that you can make. And then, of course, if you look at process of discrimination, just to choose one of the examples that you gave, I would say discrimination is very much a bureaucratic term, right? It is always about certain institutions, usually state-organized institutions, that then are being accused of discrimination. And of course, you can find some similar argumentation, because the discrimination term is so lean, I would say. It works very well also for addressing discursive processes, etc., etc. But what I would say is that if we only then speak of discrimination, we completely forget the whole overall picture. And what, you know, what we could simplify, because we don't have much time, to say there's a longue durée of racism. And this then addresses another part of your question, I would say, because of course, in history, people have not referred to themselves as racist. And this has been something that has been a big issue within racism theory for a very, very long time, for a couple of decades. Because of course, I would say that racism is transforming itself and has very different narratives, has very different knowledge practices, explains us the world in different ways, addresses different groups of people, etc. Racism is quite smart in basically hiding away from, you know, where it could be hit. So, and this is why it also partly is so strong. But I think that reducing it down to certain parts where, you know, this can be something which, you know, research must do, because it has to identify a certain question and then a certain problematic. But then if it remains at this point, I think it is too weak to understand the whole, you know, the whole transformation of how racism has developed over centuries, actually, and why it so magically is powerful to reproduce itself. Because if it was only about discrimination, we may get away with it for a certain group of people for a certain amount of time, which we do and which we did in certain historical situations. But we can't say we got rid of racism. And I think this is still a problematic. So that means, and I will finish with this, the logic of how it reproduces itself has not been successfully attacked so far.
Manuela, thank you so much for taking the time, despite the exams, to be with us.
Thank you so much.
We leave now the screen to the second speaker, Sarah Mazouz, who will speak about her paper entitled Republican Abstract Universalism and the Unspeakable Making of Race. I think you have a PowerPoint to share, so please do.
Is it right? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Milena, Graziella, and all the organizers of the Swiss Sociological Association Conference for inviting me to this panel. Today's presentation draws on an article that will be published in French Politics, Culture and Society in a special issue I co-edited along with Mathilde Cohen about whiteness in France. So let's start with two ethnographic vignettes. Give you some elements, if you want, about the context in France, just in case. So 21st of February 2005, a local prefecture of the Parisian area interview with Alain Bernard, Chief Executive Officer of the prefecture, Director of the Office of Citizenship, and head of the Committee for Equal Opportunity and Citizenship, the COPEC. The state body designed to lead the fight against all forms of discrimination. Bernard belongs to the highest rank of state employees. In his mid-40s at the time of the interview, he is also white and middle class. Throughout our conversation, he shows signs of resistance to describing certain practices as instances of racial discrimination. He even suggests that only a person who is fully assimilated, according to the standards of the prefecture staff, could make justified complaint of racial discrimination. He eventually makes his point as follows. So I just give you the quotation if you want to read it. 6th of February 2006, in the same prefecture. This time I am observing the taking of fingerprints as part of the process of issuing identity documents to newly naturalized French citizens. The street-level bureaucrats in charge are from the Office of Naturalization and the Office of Citizenship. They belong to the lowest rank of state employees and learn on the job without having received any specific legal training in immigration and citizenship law. In this prefecture, they are all white and working class. Danielle Durand is one of them. She greets a recently naturalized Black woman, checking whether she brought all the required paperwork. When examining the photograph presented by the woman, Danielle Durand declares in a very friendly tone, it's a lovely photo, but given that the background isn't light enough and you're Black, we can't see you. Your son's picture is okay because he's lighter than you. Later on, the same day, Durand also makes many open and direct comments about Islam to men she imagines are Muslim, obviously assuming that they treat their wives as subordinates. In a conversation about racial discrimination, and I have later with Durand, she systematically dismisses the testimony and complaints about racial discrimination filed in her prefecture, arguing that enough has already been done to combat racial discrimination and that the majority of complaints alleging racial discrimination are not true discrimination cases. So from the lowest to the highest ranks of state employees, a puzzling discrepancy exists between the bureaucrats' strong reluctance to recognize cases where people have been racially discriminated against and their own constant reliance on racializing categorization and ascription for those they consider of a different ancestry. This inconsistency is especially bewildering as when the issue of racial discrimination is raised, the first reaction of the prefecture employees I interviewed is typically to remind me that the French Republic recognizes only citizens and is blind to the individual's origins, which is supposed in their belief to prevent racism. They go on to stress that their own practice are guided by this requirement of colorblindness, thus asserting their abstract universalist position. In her seminal work, historian John Scott sheds light on how abstract universalism was an ideological mystification in the case of gender equality. In the case of race, far from being an ideology of inclusion, abstract universalism allows to particularize and thus racially ascribe persons perceived as non-white. In that sense, it appears to be a version of colorblind racism, enabling its proponent to perform a non-racist position when in fact enacting racism. In this presentation, I argue that abstract universalism reveals, in the case of France, the contradictory claim of colorblindness. Not only does abstract universalism support whites' ability to ignore the significance of racial discrimination and white privilege, but it also warrants particularizing and subordinating them, those seen as non-white, thus producing the political and epistemic silencing of race. How can one study and make sense of what appears to be a public secrecy a nation supposed to be race blind, yet in which race blindness serves to maintain racial discrimination unspeakable, all the while allowing racializing categorizations to be routinely expressed by state representatives. My response is thus to explore bureaucratic practices and discourse so as to highlight the ties between this use of race blindness, Republican abstract universalism, and whiteness. So, drawing on an ethnographic survey conducted in a prefecture and in a municipality of the Paris periphery between 2004 and 2009, I analyzed how Republican universalism operates as a particularizing tool enacting whiteness. I shall start from the paradoxical situation in which white state officials define themselves as race blind and universalists, whereas they are keen to racially ascribe people of color, and I will argue that race blindness is in fact a form of white blindness to racialization. Secondly, I would like to show that people of color who subscribe to the ideology of colorblindness tend to adopt a position whereby their loyalty toward the requirement of race blindness is supposed to protect them from suspicions raised by their racialized identity. But in practice, this stance internalizes the white view on them. In conclusion, I shall discuss the link between white race blindness and the failure of policies against racial discrimination in the French Republican context. So I will talk about another interviewee. Warda Ben Brahim is the daughter of a Moroccan immigrant family. When I met her in February 2005, she was in her mid-30s and worked as a women's rights policy officer at the prefect's office. She belongs to the highest rank of state employee, and after describing the specific duties of her role, she turned to the question of women who fall under a deportation order because they lack proper documentation or whose documents have expired. She told me that it is difficult for her to appeal to the prefect or the deputy prefect in defense of such cases, and explained this in these words. She then recalls what happened during the meeting of heads of all sections under the authority of the prefect, when the discussion dealt with the Eid festival and the fact that the prefect traveled around the department, with the security and public health services. Although this issue was not part of her official remit, all her colleagues looked at her as if she were supposed to have a specific reaction or a specific knowledge on that matter. This account, similar to other observations gathered in the course of my research, shows how people of color are reduced to a given racialized identity by their white colleagues, even when they do not claim that identity for themselves. Paradoxically, for the majority group, the very gesture of assigning or reducing individuals seen as others to their perceived ancestry is rooted in or justified by a particular usage of universalism. Indeed, it is precisely because they believe they occupy a universal point of view that they think they can, in the sense that they have both the ability and the right to. So what is particular about others? And I call this usage of universalism particularizing universalism. So here I give you just some element about Republican abstract universalism. And so historically, the French Republican tradition only recognizes citizens, that is, individuals who are able to transcend their particularities and act in the service of the general interest. Abstract universalism denotes a state in which citizens are members of the political body without any reference to their origin. In that state, the principle of formal equality is supposed to be fully realized, even though the theoretical construct fails to take into account the forms of inequalities produced by the process of differentiation between social groups. In a context in which the unity of the political body is based on its homogeneity, the expression of any difference is seen as a matter of privacy. It is therefore assimilated to the formulation of particularism and is disqualified as such in the public sphere. The demand for abstraction at the heart of the Republican definition of citizenship paradoxically produces the very possibility of particularizing difference. In practice, this gesture of particularization also allows those who subscribe to the ideology of abstract universalism to particularize those they perceive as different, thus essentializing their difference and radicalizing their otherness. So, on the one hand, Republican universalism enables some to particularize others. At the same time, the reference to the very idea of abstract universalism makes it possible to reject accusations of producing particularizing ascriptions. On the other hand, as it particularizes, Republican universalism produces racializing ascription. Yet the very idea of abstract universalism is used to ignore the inequalities produced by these ascriptions. These two dimensions are the driving force behind the process of denial we see at work in France when it comes to racial and more generally minority issues, as Republican universalism claims to solve and even to transcend the problem it is in fact constantly producing. Now I would like to shed light on the effect this general configuration has on the stance of people of minority origin who define themselves as French Republican. So I'm going again to talk about one of the person I met. Boubacar Diawara is a social development integration and prevention policy officer for the mayor of Doucy, the city where I carried out my survey. Originally from Mauritania, he began his college education at the Moroccan equivalent of the French National School for Administration before transferring to Nanterre University in France, where he obtained a degree in public administration. After graduation, he worked for about 10 years for various NGOs, and I met him in 2006 when he was in his mid-30s and shortly after he had taken up his position. The discussion quickly moved to the type of action taken to combat racial discrimination. I asked him about the way in which the implementation of reparation policy is conceived and answered. So you have his answer here. Boubacar Diawara's remark, like other interviewees involved in public policies against racial discrimination, raise a tension and a paradox. There is a tension in that they strive to affirm their commitment to fighting against racial discrimination, but they must constantly give proof of their allegiance to the Republican ideology. They thus insist on their opposition to the implementation of affirmative action policy, which they equate, as often in the French political and media discourse, with quota policy. Some of them also make a point of showing that their commitment to anti-discrimination is unrelated to their own experience of racism and racializing assignment. At the same time, the symbolic impact of their recruitment to a particular position is in most cases meaningful to them, for their perspective having been chosen is evidence of hiring or appointment practices that are indifferent to racializing ascriptions. So I call this position of minority loyalism to Republican race blindness minority republicanism. the stance of minority Republicans consists in asserting their adherence to the French Republic's requirement of race blindness all the more vigorously because they anticipate the suspicion that could be generated by their remark or positions on account of the origin to which they are reduced. The paradox of minority Republicans is that they refuse to implement general anti-discrimination measures targeting groups defined by race or and ethnicity in the name of the principle of formal equality and the requirement of abstract universalism. They nevertheless accept that they have been selected as tokens for race blindness, even when, as Boubacar Diawara, they admit that their presumed racial identity played a role in the hiring. So minority republicanism is one of the possible ways for people of color to prove their Frenchness despite not being white. This position derives from the fact that race blindness is in fact white blindness to the experiences of racializing ascription, racism, and racial discrimination. And abstract universalism works as a tool of particularization. Some people of color may internalize the suspicion and the particularizing impulse they are subjected to, claiming their attachment to Republican principles such as race blindness and laïcité to put themselves in a good light. To conclude, I would like to recall that I have focused on race blindness and Republican universalism in the context of interactions between members of public institutions designed to spearhead policies against racial discrimination, mainly in a prefecture of the greater Paris area. It has shown how white representatives of the state are reluctant to engage with the notion of racial discrimination and how they are nevertheless prompt to ascribe racializing categories onto those they perceive as others among their colleagues or their organization's clients. I have argued that this tension is made possible by the particularizing dimension of French abstract universalism and the fact that race blindness is a white blindness to racial ascriptions and discrimination. Workers of color at this institution tend to adopt a minority Republican position whereby they embrace the Republican requirement of race blindness as an attempt to protect themselves from suspicions arising from their perceived identity. In practice, this stance internalizes a white view on them. Even when the issue of racial discrimination emerged at the end of the 90s, its half-hearted acknowledgement did not lead to a full recognition of racial inequalities, and even less to systematic efforts to remedy them. On the contrary, the brief history of French policies against racial discrimination reveals how recognition was dismissed, turning racialization into a public secrecy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Mazouz, for also respecting the time and this terrific paper, which show very well how bureaucracy combines systemic racism and everyday racism, and also example of self-racialization by racialized people in this French context. Thank you very much. I suggest us to leave the main question, the main discussion for the end with the two and maybe the three papers so that we have enough time also to hear the third speaker, if you agree with me, unless there is a very urgent question. So thank you. We will now give the screen to John Solomos. Thank you again for his paper entitled "Where Do We Go From Here? Research and Political Agendas on Race, Racism and Immigration."
Okay, thank you to the organizers and to the other speakers. So I shall present my comments really in the context of not so much speaking about Britain, although inevitably I think my comment and my take on this discussion is framed by the fact that I have lived nearly all my life, but most of my life certainly, in an island that is part of Europe, but which often, as we have seen in the last few years, sees itself as a bit different from the rest of Europe. But and this is partly a cultural thing, but it's also reflected in the kind of academic discourses and academic language that we use to discuss questions about race and racism. So if we take, for example, the point that was raised in the kind of overall description of this session of the conference about the tendency to invisibilize race and racism, I think there are certainly trends in that direction in British society as well, but they take particular kind of forms. Over the past few decades, in fact, there has been a lot of scholarly research on racism and on race in British society. I guess partly because a lot of the kind of intellectual influences on British discussion have come from the other side of the Atlantic, from the Anglophone literature in the United States particularly. The tendency in Britain, at least, has been to have a conceptualization of debates about race and racism, which is not so much to invisibilize perhaps, but certainly we have tensions about how these ideas are constructed and reconstructed. So I think part of the point that I would like to begin with is that really, if we look at the kind of context of how we discuss debates about race and racism, probably our vision, and I'll come to this point later on in the presentation, should be certainly about Europe, and this is the focus of this session, but also I think it would be quite important to broaden our vision so that we include developments in other intellectual and geopolitical environments as well. Now, in terms of the kind of scholarship and research on race and racism and migration, which I refer to in the title of my paper today, I think one of the issues that is particularly a kind of ongoing discussion right now, which we have had over the past year or two in Britain, given the fact that there is a government in power which is really focused on perhaps moving away from notions about institutional discrimination or institutional racism, and much more towards a kind of privatized notions of racism, and to look at racism really through the lens of the individual rather than structural racism or institutional racism. One of the kind of issues that we have had in our discussions, I think in the UK particularly, but which I think has a kind of broader significance, is that in practice, when we discuss issues like racism, migration, refugees, policies about integration of minorities, policies about multiculturalism, I think there is a kind of way in which the perspectives about how we place racism in this kind of discussions is actually inflected with political and social agendas as well as scholarly agendas. So in a way, perhaps what is happening in the current environment is that certainly I think perhaps a bit different from the context in the two other countries which have been the focus of the other presentations, is that really in the kind of developing agendas we see in the British context, is that really part of the challenge we face is that really when we talk about racism, in fact, also when we talk about race, since in a way it's difficult to talk about racism without also talking about the kind of notions of race which underpin often ideas about racism, is that really we have had a kind of ongoing discussion, and this is reflected, I think, in the British context, by discussion not just about British society, but by discussion also about how issues about immigration are constructed, is that really there's a kind of underlying political and civil society debate about the place of minorities, the place of race and racialized minorities in British society. And by deduction, it is also a discussion about majority culture, minority culture, and those kind of related kind of notions. So the contested nature of categories of race and racism is part of what we have seen reflected in contemporary discussions. And earlier this year, we had perhaps one of the most controversial reports. We have had many reports about race in Britain over the last 20 years, but perhaps the most controversial was a report commissioned by the administration of Boris Johnson about racial inequalities, racial divisions in British society. And this report came out with the kind of headline argument that Britain had moved beyond institutional racism, that there was no real evidence, according to this report, that there was institutional racism in British society. There may be arguments about inequality in certain areas of society, like, for example, in health or in education, so the report argued, but there was no evidence for institutional racism or discrimination. And obviously this was a report which went somewhat against a lot of the academic scholarship and research, which over the past 20 years has kind of emphasized that despite changes we have seen in British society over the past few decades, that in fact there was a lot of evidence about discrimination, about institutional discrimination, and about sort of wider sense of developments around this kind of question. So in effect, this report, I guess, becomes symbolic of a wider tension around how we debate these issues, because although it was a debate, it was a report commissioned by the present Conservative government, it reflected, I think, a wider and intense debate going on in British society, reflected to some extent in the discussions around Brexit since the last few years, in the last 20 years, reflected in the debates about migration, refugees, but also increasingly inflected into wider discussions around the so-called cultural wars that we have going on around, for example, the legacies of slavery, the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of the kind of debates we have about national identity that are going on at the present time. So this is reflected in discussions even at a prestigious university like Oxford about the role of a particular statue in a college, a statue to Cecil Rhodes, who was a major figure in South African, particularly colonial history, British colonial history. And this kind of discussion, I think, symbolizes, in a way, a wider tension about how we deal with questions about not just the present, but how we connect the discussion of the present with a historical context. And this is, in a way, part of the context in which I think the discussion that is emerging in the kind of contemporary situation in Britain is very much a contested discussion around these issues. It's not as though there is one view, there are many views and there are many different perspectives. But also, I think it reflects the way in which inevitably any discussion of race in the present is also a discussion about how we come to terms with the past, particularly in the context where many of the migrant minority communities that have established themselves, become part of British society over the past, the past more or less 70, 80 years, really. Many of these communities have a connection with the empire, a connection with the colonial legacies of the empire, and also an ongoing connection, however disputed that is, with British society since their settlement and their integration in some way into British society. So we have, I think, in this area, part of the challenge we face about how we move on from where we're at to a kind of future analytical frame. I think what we have is really this challenge, I think, that we have at the present time is perhaps best seen in terms of how we research the present, but how we also locate the present in some kind of wider historical frame, but also, as I think is also quite important, in a comparative frame as well. And I think this relates to the kind of important point that I want to make, which is that in developing new agendas, I think there's a need to develop conceptual frameworks, which are not just the conceptual frameworks that perhaps we advocated in the 1980s or 90s, towards the end of the 20th century, but which open up to the kind of issues that we face in the present as well. Not so much to write those discussions. In the British context, for example, there were important discussions inspired by the work of scholars like Stuart Hall or Paul Gilroy and others who were influential in that period and have continued to be influential in this period as well. It's not so much that I think we need to move away from that scholarship, but we need to perhaps add to that scholarship by looking at the present as well and looking at what kind of bodies of scholarship we need to develop that can help us make sense of key issues and questions that we face in the present. I think without limiting ourselves to the points that I want to mention, I think there are issues, for example, about the nature of diversity. Some people use the term super diversity to emphasize the increasingly complex forms of migration, settlement, community formation that we have seen in societies like Britain or in other societies. There's also the issues which have been touched upon already in the other presentations about how particular minorities, particularly Muslim minorities in the last 2 decades, have been constructed and reconstructed in various ways. There's the whole debate which is ongoing about integration, whatever that term means. And sometimes it's used to refer to multiculturalism, sometimes it's also used to refer to the way in which we construct a new kind of identity around the nation and culture. There's also inevitably, I think in the present environment, questions about migration and race, which are often seen in different kind of ways, but which I think also link up together. And in the British context, certainly what we have had in the context of debates about Brexit, there's the increasing focusing of attention on forms of nativism, white nationalism. Ironically, of course, the present government is both a government which espouses a kind of form of British nativism, but which is also, and this is not a point I can explore in more detail, but it's also one of the most ethnically, racially diverse governments that we have had in our history in the UK. And you can see it in the front bench, in the main ministers of this government. But it's a government which is definitely committed both to a version of accepting diversity, but also a kind of accepting a kind of nativism at the same time. And this is part of the point I want to make, that we have various contradictory developments that we need to make sense of. And it doesn't mean that we have the tools, I think, to analyze this development. I think in the British context, there is a lot of reference, particularly given the Anglophone influence from the United States, around critical race theory as perhaps the way to go forward in this discussion. But it seems to me part of the dilemma we face is that many of the kind of assumptions which underpin critical race theory, the way it has developed, are often framed around a US-centric model of race theorizing and theorizing about racism. And whatever the merits of critical race theory as such, and of course this is a subject of a wider discussion, it seems to me that part of the challenge we face is that we cannot just sort of use a shorthand like critical race theory to describe all the complex issues that exist in the British or perhaps also the wider European environment. We need to engage in conversations that actually allow us to use critical concepts of theorizing about race and racism, but which are not necessarily just imported notions, it seems to me. In fact, part of the challenge is that really it's not, I think, just a question of importing ideas perhaps from North America, but also we should be asking questions about whether we can learn from the kind of discussions that are going on in a broader global context to develop a more comparative analytical frame that would not exclude, for example, discussions going on in Latin America as well as North America, discussions going on in the global south, in parts of Africa, at least in Asia, beyond, in terms of developing frames that can allow us to analyze the present and to learn from different scholarly traditions. One example of this, which I think is important to contextualize, is that I think in Britain and in many European societies, we're not just analyzing racism, but we're analyzing, quite importantly, anti-racist mobilizations, anti-racist policies, whether they're part of official government policy or the work of local government, local authorities in the British context, or a wider anti-racist social imaginary, which includes attempts to develop in the British context, for example, versions of Black Lives Matter or decolonizing universities, which is something we come across almost on a daily basis at a university like the University of Warwick, where when you're teaching a course, it's almost inevitable that your students will engage with you with questions about decolonizing the curriculum, with those kind of debates. And it seems to me part of the challenge we face is that we're not having just to make sense of racism, but also what kind of anti-racist mobilizations and initiatives can actually challenge the present kind of agendas that we see, or at least provide alternative visions that would be different. And this is, I think, part of the challenge that we face, not just, I think, in Britain, but also more broadly. So in posing that question I did at the beginning of or the title of my paper, at least, about where do we go from here? And obviously, there are different angles at which we can look at this. And I think the two other papers reflected this, that there are different conversations, different debates going on in different countries, and I'm aware of that. And I'm not trying to impose a vision which is purely based on the British context. But it seems to me that in order to develop conversations, we need to develop a way in which we can actually understand the present without reducing it simply to the past, and also understand the possibilities for change in the present. And this is part of the point I was trying to make, I guess, in talking about anti-racist social imaginaries and the way in which we can think about them in the present. The kind of mobilizations that took place in Britain during 2020, particularly around various kind of colonial era or slavery era statues, the mobilizations that took place around Black Lives Matter highlight the way in which, in a way, despite official government policies which deny the existence of institutionalized racism, there are other discourses which are also very influential in our society, which are actually arguing the opposite of official government policy. And it's partly how we make sense of all these contradictory and deeply contested developments that it seems to me we need to develop both theoretical and also empirically based forms of analysis that can help us understand the present and make sense of the present. And just to give us time for discussion, I will finish on that point.
Thank you very much, John Salomos, for making us think about the future as well, from here in Switzerland, it seems far away to think about anti-racism. We are still trying to think about racism, I guess. But thank you. We lost one of our speaker, Manuela Boyachev, but we gained another great colleagues that I can see here, and another great scholar, Michel Lamont, who is with us as well, which will, I guess, lead to a very interesting discussion. And I give you the screen, Graziella, to open up this discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Manuela, in absence. I mean, it's been very interesting to hear you. And in many ways, I hear you from someone who has insisted for a while now to think about racism in comparative perspective. So in many ways, I was very much encouraged by the question that Manuela posed in the beginning. And I should warn you that I only had access to Sarah's paper, so I'm improvising here a little bit. But I think it's important to take seriously her question. Should we think about racism, or should we think about racisms in the plural? And she was very direct and said, no, it's still important to think about racism. It's still a very useful analytical concept. And I think it's hard to disagree with that. And I think all of us who are here somehow agree with that. I think that's a clear moral reason for that. Racism isn't just. And the language of racism, and that's why I push her a little bit on that. I think it's a category of accusation. And in many ways, that leads us also to push an anti-racist agenda in our research and in the way that we live life. There's also the reason that racism, it's sort of the source of what people like Charles Tilly would call durable inequalities, but that other people that talk about colonial or decolonial processes are also really rooting racism in process of continual colonization, institutional and structural practices, as Sarah showed it in her presentation. Also, I think it's fair to say, and I think Sarah's work again showed it very well, that racism is often about denying the possibility of equality in difference. So in many ways, racism is about denying difference in different settings. And I think the recognition of difference and the recognition of the possibility of difference, it's increasingly something that it's cherished by most people. So in that sense, the discussion of racism, it's also about that. And I think also the language of racism and anti-racism is increasingly transnational. So in that sense, thinking about racism as one processual force, that it's a possibility, it's a shared transnational history of oppression, but it's also a possibility of creating a transnational anti-racist movement. And I think that Black Lives Matter and how it's sort of echoed even in Switzerland. So in that sense, I do think that you are too pessimistic, Milena. There is the possibility of an anti-racist discourse in different ways. But I also think that when we move to a research agenda, and as sociologists, I think at the end of the day, we are doing research that it's often based on the empirical level. It's important to think about racisms in the plural and not only in the singular. And I think part of it is just because racism do work differently. And I think both John and Sarah, and in some way Manuela also insisted on that. I mean, if we take seriously the idea that all of us almost put in our footnotes in our papers, especially I think working in Europe, that race is a social construction, that we don't believe in any sort of biological basis of race. In many ways, what we are trying to do here, it's really say it is, in order to understand race and racism, we need to understand how it is constructed. In that sense, it is constructed, it's always contextualized. But we also, I think it's important to think about racism in the plural to avoid what I would call some type of conceptual colonialism. And I think because the discussions about racism and its conceptualization has been largely dominated by American academia, and I'm not saying that it's bad, good or bad, but when we simply look at racism in the singular, oftentimes we tend to think about those concepts without really dialoguing with the different processes. So in that sense, thinking about racisms in the plural also allow us to understand that, okay, there is the big analytical concept, but the way that it's going to act and function in the local, it will vary a lot. But I think it's also important to think that there are new challenges and different challenges in different parts of the world. And I think in that sense, again, both John and Sarah's paper really show that. And I think, John, the whole debate on decolonization, it's key. And recently I spoke to a few UK colleagues, and for me, it's always interesting how the concept of the colonial and of racism is so linked in the UK. And it's something that I would love to hear if you have time for a second round. Why do you think this is so linked in the UK and not so much in other parts of Europe? I would say where the discussion of the colonial, and even in Latin America, where those two concepts are not so interlinked. And in the case of Sarah, when you bring up the idea of minority republicanism, one thing, and I will send you more detailed comments later because we don't have a lot of time, but one thing that I kept thinking as I read your paper and I heard you, is that the minority republicanism, is it can you think about it as an anti-racist strategy of those street-level bureaucrats? Is that a way that they are thinking about including themselves, even if at the expense of excluding others? Or do you think about this as more almost like a false consciousness, that they are not even aware that they are doing this? And it really made me think about, one, John Scretini's work on street-level bureaucrats and race and anti-racism strategies, and how he shows that it was really important to push anti-racist agendas in the US, that street-level bureaucrats really had that agenda, and middle-level bureaucrats. And on the other hand, more recent work in political science that has been showing how electoral candidates who are Black in the US and conservative tend to gain much more votes for being Black than Democrat candidates. And this is something that a lot that people have been saying, that in a way, it makes Republicans feel good about themselves to vote for a Black candidate. It makes them feel anti-racist, even if their agenda has nothing to do with race. So I don't know, I don't have time to develop much this idea, but I keep thinking how much the presence of the street level bureaucrats and their minority republicanism, what is the impact for that, for the reproduction of racism in France? How do you see that? And just to finish, I completely agree with John's point that I think thinking about racisms in the plural also allow us to think about anti-racisms in the plural. And I think for a long time we tried in a way to think about the civil rights in the US as the example of anti-racism movement. And I think in many ways it is exemplary and it is a beautiful movement that everybody should learn. But I think more and more, and here really think about Latin America and the work of Monica Moreno and Peter Wade, who have been showing that there are different ways to be anti-racist. And sometimes it's not even necessary to put the language of race in the forefront, although it should be there and should not deny race. But there are different ways to think about this, and maybe we should be aware that there are those different anti-racisms, and thinking about racism in the plural will allow us to think about anti-racisms in the plural. And I'll stop here, so hopefully we still have a few minutes at least.
Thank you very much. We can extend, if you have time, until 14:50. But no more, then we will disappear automatically.
I think Sarah cannot.
So
maybe start you, Sarah, so we can hear you a little bit at least.
Yes, thank you for these questions and comments. I would say about the minority Republicans. I don't think it's an anti-racist strategy. I would rather say that it's a way for them to show that they are part of the majority group, and that also it's a way to show loyalty to a system, the French Republic. They assume it is non-racist. And so the whole thing is to reassure, to reinforce the fact that despite the identity they are ascribed to, they are in fact good French citizens. I would say that it is rather individualistic and in relation to the way in which they define and perceive the French Republic. And if I may, I would like to also answer your question, comment about the discussion on colonialism, and in fact the great difference between what is happening now in the UK and what is happening in France. And I think that what we show now in France, that all the resistance against the fact of talking about, the legacy of colonialism, the way in which we have to decolonialize the university, the medias, the political milieu, etc., is precisely because talking about colonialism would lead to talk about race and to recognize the social and political significance of race in the French history, but also now, currently. And I think it's Laura Stoller who talks about French aphasia about colonialism, and we are still facing that. But the root of this silence on colonialism and the difficulty to just point out some legacies is due to the fact that if you talk about that, you will have to admit that race is still an active system of hierarchy and power relationship within the French society.
John, would you like to add something about decolonialism and racism?
Mm-hmm. I think part of the context for the attention we have on this issue in the British context is that particularly, I think, over the past decade or so, we have had very important work, not so much actually by sociologists, but by historians and by social historians who have tried to recover that kind of more or less the kind of hidden history of the impact of colonialism and slavery on British society. And I think that has fed into wider discussions, like in the context of the work of some historians. It has led to a lot of programs on TV and a lot of programs involving museums, like the Slavery Museum in Liverpool and other kind of museums. And I think that has become part of the context in which we have had much more discussion recently about colonialism and decolonialism in the context of British society. It's not to say, I think, that it's kind of universally accepted. As I tried to mention, there are quite different views about this, particularly within the political sphere. But I think within the kind of academic sphere and within the kind of the sphere that includes museums and cultural institutions, I think there's much more acceptance of the need to come to terms with that legacy of colonialism and slavery. And I think that kind of work, I think, will go on despite clear messages from the current administration that they don't favor such a development. But it doesn't mean that there won't be work going on within academic institutions or within cultural institutions like museums that actually tries to bring that much more into the discussion. And of course, also another big influence is the fact that there is a kind of influence from the United States on British discussions, which I tried to mention as well. Not always an influence which I would say, as I said, I don't think, for example, the constant references by my students and others that they're developing a critical theory perspective, a critical race theory perspective, they don't always convince me, but that influence is there, So nearly all my students begin their essays by saying they're going to use a critical race theory perspective. And when I type back to them, what do you mean by that? Often they repeat certain statements, and I'm not sure that that's sufficient, really.
Thank you very much. I think we are almost over. It's passed so quickly. We can continue on to discuss in the community space if you would like. I would like to thank really all of you to have accepted our invitation in our local congress. It was very interesting. We will continue to read you, of course, and please join us also for the keynote at 5, because we will continue in related issue with Michel Lamont somehow. Thank you again, and yes, see you soon. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.